In 1860, which is the year before the Civil War, no Republican owned a slave. Now notice I'm not saying that no Republican leader owned a slave. I'm saying that no Republican in the United States owned a slave. And if that's true, it means that all the slaves in the country, there were 4 million at the time, this was the zenith of American slavery, 4 million slaves were all owned by Democrats.
From the premise that no Republican owned slaves in 1860, Dinesh D'Souza leaps to the conclusion that only Democrats owned slaves in 1860. On that basis, Dinesh D'Souza labels the Democrats as the party of slavery. There are 3 ways to debunk this argument. The hardest way is the way that Dinesh D'Souza tells us to do it, by attacking the premise, by trying to demonstrate that some Republicans owned slaves in 1860.
All you have to do is give me the name of one solitary Republican who owned a slave, and I would have to take it back.
And even if we are successful in that endeavor, it will be very unrewarding when Dinesh D'Souza then turns around and says, "Congratulations, you found an exception to my generalization that Republicans did not own slaves in 1860, but the generalization still stands." D'Souza tells us that we must challenge his premise because he knows that it is difficult, and that ultimately it will be a waste of time. A somewhat better way to debunk the argument is to note that its logic is flawed. D'Souza commits the fallacy known as false dilemma. His argument assumes that everyone in the United States in 1860 was either a Republican or a Democrat, and that if slaveholders were not Republicans, then they must have been Democrats. That is a false dilemma. The third and strongest way to debunk the argument is to demonstrate directly that its conclusion is wrong. If we can show that there were slaveholders who were not Democrats, then Dinesh D'Souza was wrong to claim that only Democrats owned slaves in 1860. This is easy to demonstrate. The future Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander H. Stephens, owned slaves, and in 1860 he was not a Democrat but a member of the Constitutional Unionist Party, which ran John Bell as its candidate in the 1860 presidential election. There were also know-nothings like Robert Jefferson Breckinridge and nonpartisans like Ulysses S. Grant who owned slaves. The conclusion that only Democrats owned slaves in 1860 is therefore clearly wrong. The Democrats were not the party of slavery. More examples can be had by going back in time. Many of the early presidents of the United States who were not Democrats owned slaves, beginning with George Washington. Clearly, Democrats were never the party of slavery. The intelligent response to D'Souza's bad argument, therefore, is to bypass the argument, to reject his challenge to do research into an obscure question that D'Souza himself surely has not done, and instead simply to point out that the argument itself is logically invalid and leads to a false conclusion.